Claire Whitmore's car gave out on Victory Drive at 5:30 in the evening on a Thursday, drenched in a heavy summer storm in Savannah where dark clouds sank over the city as if the universe itself was in a foul mood. And today it seemed to carry a touch of cruel irony with it. Rush hour, dusk falling, and she was stranded with an old car that had long stopped believing in its own electrical system. A stranger pulled over, lowered his window, and looked straight at her, with a deep, steady voice, saying that she should get in, and he would take her home. And that was how one stalled engine in the rain became the beginning of everything. Claire's morning had been nothing remarkable. She had survived 3 back-to-back surgeries at the small veterinary clinic tucked in an ivy-covered building on the south side of Savannah. A Labrador choking on a chicken bone, a cat that had leaped from the second floor and dislocated both front legs, and a pet hedgehog with pneumonia after a cold bath. Thursday somehow always seemed to be the day animals made their most foolish decisions. When the clock struck 5, she was exhausted, her scrubs steeped in disinfectant sweat and a smear of dried blood from the cat she had just stitched up. All she wanted was to return to her tiny East Side apartment, collapse onto the sofa with a tub of vanilla ice cream and a trashy show to quiet her heavy mind. She changed in the break room, slipping into jeans and a white t-shirt, pulling on the worn leather jacket she kept at the clinic for days like this. Her old Ford Fusion waited in the lot, soaked and silent, like a shivering stray. The check engine light had been glowing for 2 weeks, but she kept ignoring it. Between saving animals and keeping up with the utility bills, her car came last on her list of priorities, but it seemed to have opinions of its own. She had barely driven a few blocks before the first raindrops fell, followed quickly by a downpour. Rain in Savannah did not fall gently. It roared down as if the sky was grieving something grave. The engine light flickered, a faint whine followed, the car shuddered, and then steam billowed from the hood like a dying breath. Claire managed to pull over just before it died completely. She sat for a moment trying to push back the wave of helplessness rising in her chest. Darkness crawled in. Rain hammered like a pounding heart. She called Emily only to reach voicemail. She called her parents in Atlanta, a 4-hour drive away, no help possible. She had no roadside service. Uber estimated 45 minutes and her phone battery was at 15%. She stood in ankle-deep water at the edge of the road, drenched, watching car after car streak past, as if she didn't exist. Then he appeared. A charcoal gray SUV stopped a few yards behind her stalled car, headlights slicing through the rain. The man stepped out holding a deep blue umbrella. He wore a black shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, dress slacks and polished shoes that somehow remained spotless despite the wet pavement. His hair was dark with strands of silver, his eyes deep and unreadable. Claire instinctively stepped back, but he simply stood there, raising the umbrella to cover both of them, as if this small gesture could erase the storm swallowing her. He told her car was broken not as a question, but as a fact. She replied dryly that she had eyes. He didn't smile, only tilted his head, glanced around the deserted road, and told her to get in because he would take her home. His voice held no pressure, no threat. It felt like a simple directive, something already decided. Every bit of logic in her screamed a warning. Do not get into a stranger's car. She had listened to too many true crime podcasts. Yet there was something in his eyes, not danger but certainty, warmth, understanding, and she was soaked cold, exhausted, and covered in street grit all the way up to her collar. She told him she didn't know who he was. He offered his hand, saying his name was Daniel Rivas. Claire shook his hand, introducing herself, her fingers icy against his steady warmth. A passing truck splashed a wave of dirty water over both of them. Claire exhaled, surrendering. She thanked him. He nodded and guided her toward the SUV, with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to protecting others. Inside, warm air drifted from the vents, the leather seats soft beneath her, the scent of mint and cedarwood comforting. Daniel climbed in and closed the door, asking for her address. She told him Oak Street near Forsyth Square, and he said it would take about 20 minutes before driving off. Claire leaned back, shivering slightly, partly from the cold and partly from not understanding why she felt so safe when just minutes ago she was ready to scream if anyone came near. But perhaps sometimes all a person needs in life is a stalled car, a heavy rainstorm, and a stranger who looks at you and says he will take you home. If you are still listening, thank you for spending this time walking through the rain with Claire and Daniel. If this story made you smile, tightened something in your chest, or simply feel a little warmer in the middle of a long day, please remember to subscribe, tap the heart, and share so we can bring you many more tender stories like this one day after day. Where are you listening from? A quiet corner of a coffee shop in Houston, a small, peaceful room in Seattle, or some distant snowy state far across the country? Leave a comment and tell us where you are, so we can know how many hearts and how many places this little story has reached across America. Thank you for staying. The story is not over yet, and the next part is where the emotions begin to grow. The steady rhythm of the windshield wipers moved like a slow heartbeat, pulling Claire back into the present as Daniel guided the SUV into the sluggish line of cars crawling through the flooded street. The storm had not eased, but inside his vehicle it was warm, quiet, and impossibly safe, and though she was still soaked through, her hair clinging to her cheeks and her leather jacket heavy with water, what struck her most was the sense that she had stepped into another world entirely. A world where strangers stopped in the rain, opened their doors, and asked for an address without expecting anything in return. Daniel drove with the calm assurance of a man who was never in a hurry, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road as if he knew exactly where he was going. The silence between them was filled by a soft classical piece drifting from the speakers, a melancholic piano melody that matched the weather with uncanny precision. Claire glanced at him from the passenger seat, cautious, yet unable to stop her own curiosity. He looked older than she was, perhaps in his mid-30s, his face defined by strong lines that somehow did not make him severe, his eyes deep, his voice warm, and his entire presence unlike any man she had encountered before. He seemed like the kind of man a woman might dream about, after a glass of red wine and an old movie playing past midnight. She broke the silence by asking if he lived in Savannah, and he said he did, that he had grown up there and lived in the southern part of the city near the river, then asked if she had been born there, and she told him no, she was from Athens and had moved after finishing veterinary school. He repeated the word veterinary with a faint smile, noting that it explained the lingering scent of disinfectant and dog fur on her jacket, making her laugh softly, a little embarrassed. She apologized if it bothered him, and he told her it didn't, that he owned a Doberman named Leo and was long familiar with such smells. She laughed again when Daniel told her the dog was intimidating only when necessary, and otherwise clung to people like a kindergartner, terrified of fireworks and hating the sound of the vacuum. For the first time since her car died, Claire felt a small but genuine laugh escape her. Daniel tilted his head as if he noticed. They slipped back into silence, but this time it was comfortable, and as the SUV glided beneath the dense trees lining Habersham, the streetlights cast pale streaks over the raindrops on the glass. Claire brushed her damp hair behind her ear and checked her phone. 12% battery, no signal. She asked whether he often picked up strangers in the rain, half joking, half not, and he told her no, that this was the first time. When she asked why he had stopped, he was quiet for a moment before saying that he did not want to drive past her, go home and spend the rest of the night wondering if she had been all right. The simple truth of it made something tighten gently inside her, because she could not remember the last time someone cared for her without conditions, without pretense, without any reason except genuine concern. She turned slightly to look at him more clearly, and thanked him sincerely, telling him that without him, she might have spent another 40 minutes standing in the rain, only to end up in an Uber, with a driver who did not speak English, and an air conditioner that didn't work. Daniel glanced at her with a small, rare smile that made her turn away too quickly, her heartbeat slipping a little off rhythm. The SUV pulled onto her street lined with old southern homes, white porches, and cascades of bright purple bougainvillea unfazed by the storm. Daniel stopped in front of her second-floor apartment with its warm yellow porch light glowing through the rain. He did not turn off the engine. Claire reached for her seatbelt, ready to thank him again and step out when he handed her a small folded note scribbled in slanted handwriting telling her it was his number if she ever needed anything. She took it, looking at him once more, not asking why he wrote it on paper instead of typing it into her phone, understanding without words that handwriting made it more personal, more real. She thanked him for everything, and he wished her a good night. Claire stepped out into the soft mist of what remained of the storm, and Daniel stayed where he was until she reached her door and closed it behind her. Leaning back against it, her heart beat quickly for a reason she could not yet name. In her hand was a small piece of paper, and in her chest was the unmistakable sense that her life had just turned down a road that appeared nowhere on any plan she had ever made. The next morning, Claire stepped into the veterinary clinic with her hair still carrying the faint scent of last night's rain, her white blouse wrinkled from not being pressed, and a strange, lingering feeling quietly simmering in her chest. Emily was making coffee in the break room, and the moment she lifted her cup, she turned and narrowed her eyes at Claire as if she could sniff out a secret. She pointed directly at Claire's face and said that she was 5 minutes late, flushed dreamy-eyed, and had clearly met someone the night before. Claire sighed and settled into a chair, propping her chin on her hand as she explained that her car had broken down in the rain. Emily groaned dramatically and guessed that a mysterious, handsome, wealthy man in a luxury car had stopped for her, and Claire looked at her with helpless disbelief, asking whether she was joking or stalking her. Emily collapsed onto the table, laughing, stunned that Claire had truly been rescued by a stranger in the rain, like something straight out of a movie. Claire told her the whole story, from the moment the car stalled to the way Daniel stepped out of his SUV, like a character emerging from a romantic southern noir, and finally, to the small slip of paper with a phone number written in neat slanted handwriting. Emily listened without interrupting, her eyes brightening with each detail, and when she learned Claire had actually gotten into his car, she was stunned, reminding her that she had not stepped into anyone else's vehicle since her first year of college and barely allowed pizza delivery inside her apartment. Claire admitted it sounded crazy, but said it hadn't felt frightening, that Daniel had been polite, steady, and had a Doberman named Leo who was afraid of vacuum cleaners, which made Emily clutch her chest, as if overwhelmed by too much sweetness. She insisted Claire had to call him, and when Claire hesitated, Emily threatened to do it herself, demanding a photo of the note, while Claire laughed and shook her head, even as her heart beat faster than usual. Meanwhile, not far away in an old Southern-style house near the river, Daniel sat in the kitchen with a steaming cup of black coffee, while his 12-year-old daughter Olivia ate breakfast with the distracted speed of someone uninterested in anything except the messages on her phone. She asked if he had something to tell her without looking up, and when he said no, she questioned why he had woken up earlier than usual, shaved, made coffee properly, and smiled at himself in the kitchen mirror. Daniel raised a brow and asked if she was spying on him, and she said she didn't need to because he was acting like the main character in the second season of a drama series, and she intended to find out what was going on. After a moment, he admitted that he had helped a woman whose car had broken down, and Olivia's eyes shot up as she asked if the woman was beautiful, what her name was, and what she did for a living. When he told her Claire was a veterinarian, she groaned dramatically and accused him of writing a romance novel about a mysterious man rescuing a vet in the rain, then asked whether he had given her his number. Daniel said he had left it for her, and Olivia leaned forward with laser-like intensity, asking if he liked her. After a beat, Daniel admitted that maybe he did, which made Olivia beam as if receiving an early Christmas present, and declare that her mother would approve as well. Daniel paused but nodded, saying he knew. She told him that if Claire ever called, he was forbidden from being overly intense, delivering philosophical Mafia-style lines, or intimidating anyone, but should simply be himself in a gentle, modern way. Daniel chuckled and promised to try. Olivia slung her backpack over her shoulder and headed for the door, saying that if Claire loved dogs and could tolerate her sense of humor, then she was the right match, and if Daniel ruined it, she would refuse to speak to him for 3 days. He watched her leave, her ponytail swaying her stride full of youthful confidence, And he took the last sip of his coffee, while thinking of Claire, of the look in her eyes, as she sat in his car, soaked, exhausted, yet unmistakably strong. If she called, then maybe this time things could be different. Maybe. Claire was examining the teeth of a slightly temperamental calico cat when Emily suddenly pushed open the clinic door, poked her head inside, and looked at her with eyes so bright it seemed she might explode from holding in a secret too long. She announced that there was a patient waiting in the lobby and that Claire would definitely want to handle this case herself. Claire tilted her head and raised a brow, reminding Emily that she was in the middle of something, but Emily insisted that the cat could wait and vanished like a gust of wind, leaving Claire both curious and wary. She stroked the cat's back to reassure it, handed it gently to the assistant, removed her gloves, and stepped into the lobby. And there he was. Daniel Rivas, dressed simply in a deep blue shirt, dark jeans, and worn leather shoes that did nothing to diminish his quiet composure, standing beside a sleek black Doberman whose folded ears and relaxed tongue made him look more like an oversized child than a fearsome guard dog. Daniel was bent down, rubbing the dog's head, but when he heard her footsteps, he looked up, their eyes meeting for a second long enough to make something inside Claire's chest give a small, sharp pull. He greeted her softly and said he thought it was time for Leo to meet the doctor. Claire tried to keep her voice steady, though she couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at her lips, and Daniel replied that Google had led him back to the woman who had once sat soaked beside him in his passenger seat. Claire knelt to stroke Leo's back, feeling the warmth beneath his smooth coat, and asked what was wrong. Daniel explained that it wasn't serious, that Leo had been eating less and coughing occasionally, and thought it best to have him checked. She led them into the examination room, Daniel taking a seat while she examined Leo's ears, teeth, and abdomen, the dog surprisingly gentle despite being nearly twice her size. Daniel observed that Leo trusted her, adding that dogs could sense things, and when Claire lifted her gaze, their eyes met again, not with urgency or flirtation, but with a quiet attention that felt steady and real. She said she felt it too and called Leo sweet, prompting Daniel to warn that if she called him an adorable fluffball, his pride might suffer, making Claire laugh. Daniel smiled before letting his eyes rest on her hand, resting lightly on Leo's back, and told her she hadn't called. She looked up and admitted she knew, adding that it wasn't because she didn't want to, but because she felt that if they were meant to meet again, it should happen naturally without pressure or expectation. Daniel nodded slowly as if he had anticipated such an answer, then asked what she thought now. Claire stepped back slightly as if giving herself space, though her eyes never left his, and she replied that perhaps fate had a way of scheduling veterinary appointments. Daniel let out a soft laugh and took a small box from his pocket, explaining that it contained Leo's vitamins and that he wasn't sure which ones to continue. Claire examined the label and told him she would review everything carefully and call him later that afternoon. Daniel said he would wait. He stood Leo rising beside him like a loyal guardian, and as they reached the door, Claire called his name. He turned and she told him that next time if Leo needed a follow-up, he could make an appointment, but if he happened to stop by unexpectedly, she wouldn't mind. Daniel nodded, something gentle flickering in his eyes, then stepped out with Leo, leaving behind a faint trace of cologne, the scent of wood, and of a man who never rushed, yet always seemed to know exactly where he was going. Claire remained still for a moment, the list of vitamins in her hand, and a lightness in her chest like a soft breeze. She didn't know what awaited her next, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity: the rainstorm that night had not ended anything. It had only just begun. Claire had not planned on being the one to text first. She had promised herself she would let things unfold naturally, allowing that rain-soaked night to remain something beautiful instead of something burdened by expectation. But when she finished reviewing Leo's vitamins and realized one of them wasn't recommended for dogs over 40 kilos, she knew she had to let him know. That was the official reason. The unofficial one was that she wanted to hear his voice. The message she sent at 1:17 was simple: telling him he should stop the D3 supplement and that she could recommend an alternative if he was free to meet at the Saturday morning cafe on Jones Street that afternoon. At the 18th minute, his reply arrived asking if 3 o'clock worked. By 3:05, Claire was already seated by the large window overlooking the rain-swept sidewalk, 2 paper cups on the table. Today's rain was gentler than the storm that had brought them together, falling with the soft persistence of an old storyteller sharing a memory. The cafe was warm, filled with the scent of waffles and espresso, with soft jazz humming from the low-ceiling speakers. Daniel arrived exactly on time. The bell over the door chimed softly as he stepped inside, wearing a charcoal gray knit jacket, his hair slightly damp, his face carrying the same composed, unmistakably steady expression that marked him. His eyes found hers in a single second, and he walked toward her. She told him the cup with extra cream was hers, and the dark, strong one was his. He removed his watch, and placed it on the table, a small gesture that made her feel he was fully present with nowhere else he needed to be. She asked how Leo was doing, and Daniel replied that he had started eating again and likely just needed rest and less time swallowing things, he shouldn't admitting that the dog had a talent for eating shoes. Claire suggested shoes probably carried emotional value, and Daniel laughed quietly but sincerely. She noticed he had a habit of looking directly into someone's eyes when he listened, not distracted, not glancing at his phone, not nodding politely. He sat there as though every part of his attention belonged to her. He admitted he was surprised she had texted, and she admitted she was surprised too. When he asked whether her reasons were professional or personal, she told him both, and he said he appreciated both. She teased him about sounding like a character in a well-edited novel, and he explained that he worked with people who had to choose their words carefully, a habit that had stayed with him. When she asked what he did, he paused and said he managed several family businesses, a description so intentionally vague she understood instantly that he would tell her more only if the time was right. What mattered was that she didn't mind waiting. Some people you rush to figure out. Daniel was someone you approach slowly, layer by layer, like peeling an orange with care so as not to bruise the sweetness beneath. He asked whether every Thursday of hers ended with rain, a broken car, and a stranger, and she admitted that usually only the rain was consistent. The broken car was a specialty of the month, and the stranger was the unexpected variable. Daniel tilted his head, holding her gaze slightly longer than before, telling her he didn't want to be a variable. Her lips pressed together in a small, unsteady smile, her heart shifting the way it does when a favorite song begins to play unexpectedly in a familiar diner. She said she wasn't sure she wanted him to be someone who simply passed by, and he answered that if she hadn't been the one standing there that night, he wouldn't have stopped. She looked at him serious, sincere, with nothing performative in his eyes, and she believed him. Their conversation drifted to softer topics. Olivia loved biology and hated math. Leo had once destroyed an entire shed door during a thunderstorm, and Claire had failed her first job interview because she cried saying goodbye to a patient's rabbit. Their laughter came in small waves, but enough. Their glances lingered quiet, but enough. When they stood to leave, the rain had stopped. Daniel opened the door for her to step out first. He asked whether he could call her next time without needing a vitamin-related excuse, and Claire nodded, saying she would make the coffee stronger. He promised to bring stories to match. They parted at the corner without holding hands or hugging, but her eyes followed him as he walked away. And for the first time in a very long while, Claire felt as though she were stepping into a road with no clear destination, but one she wanted to explore. And this time she would not be walking it alone. In the days that followed their coffee meeting, nothing changed in any dramatic way, yet nothing was quite the same either. Claire still arrived at work on time, still stitched up wounds on dogs, scraped tartar from cats' teeth, and administered vaccinations to rabbits. But now each morning began with a simple message from Daniel. Sometimes a quiet good morning, sometimes a small question, like whether it was raining or whether she had already had her coffee. Those modest, repeated gestures began to reach a part of her she had long grown used to keeping tucked away. They didn't have long formal dates or hours spent in elegant restaurants. Everything between them unfolded quietly, slowly, like a wordless jazz melody playing on a rainy afternoon. Once Daniel stopped by the clinic just to bring her a bag of apple-filled cookies from the famous bakery downtown. He didn't stay long, only saying that he had been passing by and thought she would like them. Then left while she and Emily stared at each other as though they had witnessed something belonging to a different world. Another time, Claire finished work late, rain falling again, and when she stepped outside, she saw the familiar SUV parked along the curb, its window rolling down as Daniel's voice drifted through the thin curtain of rain, telling her he didn't think she should walk home that evening. She didn't refuse. They sat in the car without speaking much, listening to the rain tapping against the glass, until the silence between them felt like something shared rather than empty. There was a night she invited him in, not for a real date, but simply because she had cooked too much soup and thought someone at the end of a long day might need dinner. Daniel arrived with a bottle of red wine and a gentle smile. They ate on the sofa, watched an old film she had once loved, and talked about things people do not usually confess. The first time, how Daniel had once wanted to become a lawyer, how Claire had almost studied art before switching to veterinary medicine because she couldn't bear seeing animals in pain without help. There was something unforced in the way they shared, no rush, no performance, just small pieces of their lives set on the table, like little gifts, which made breathing next to each other feel strangely easier. Olivia knew everything. She could tell simply by the way Daniel answered the phone. She told him one evening, head down over her math homework, that his voice had changed, that he spoke more softly, as if afraid the person on the other end might slip away. Daniel didn't respond, but she looked up and smiled, saying she didn't mind and that she liked hearing him laugh. Daniel was not the kind of man who laughed easily, and Claire was not the kind of woman to say sweet things just to fill silence. But when they met at the park during her lunch break, drinking coffee on a bench while watching children play, Claire whispered that she couldn't remember the last time she felt this calm. Daniel didn't answer immediately, only nodded, his eyes softening, before telling her he remembered the last time he felt that way 8 years ago, before everything had changed. She didn't ask anything more. She didn't need to. That small nod and the gentle squeeze of his hand were enough for Claire to understand that they were slowly walking through each other's pasts, not to erase anything, but to understand, to accept, little by little. Each brief meeting became a small brick placed between them, building something without a defined shape, yet steady enough to stand. And Claire, between small surgeries, brief messages, and unplanned dinners, began to realize that she might actually be growing fond of someone, not in the shallow, fleeting way, but in the kind that makes you want to go home. Not just because it is your place, but because someone somewhere might be waiting. All it takes is a single message. On Saturday afternoon, Claire was reorganizing the medicine cabinet in the clinic when she heard the front bell ring. Emily had already left early. The entire place was quiet, except for the light breeze slipping through the cracked window. Claire stepped out to the reception desk, wiping her hands on her blouse, assuming it was a client who had forgotten an appointment, or perhaps an unexpected emergency. But when she opened the door, her heart tightened, as though a fist had closed around it. Standing before her in the fading glow of late afternoon was Marcus, the man she had once called her husband. Claire froze for a moment, her eyes taking in the worn jacket he still favored. The beard no longer trimmed the way it used to be, and the familiar posture slightly hunched, slightly unsure, yet still carrying that quiet confidence of a man who knew he could unsteady someone if he wished. He greeted her, his voice deep, the same voice that had softened her countless times, telling her he'd heard she was still in Savannah. Claire didn't answer immediately. She had never imagined she would see Marcus here again, not after everything, not after the divorce, not after the cold, cavernous years of silence when he had vanished from her life without a backward glance. She asked why he was there, her voice neither warm nor hostile, and he said he was in town for work, that Atlanta was only a 3-hour drive, and that he thought he should come and talk to her about them. His reply sliced through the stillness like a sharp pair of scissors. Claire took a half step back, instinctively bracing herself. She reminded him there was no them anymore. He looked at her with a mixture of regret and the old stubbornness she remembered too well admitting. He knew he had been wrong, that he had thought about everything about what he had missed, and that he wanted to start again. She told him he was several years too late. He said he heard she hadn't remarried and wondered if there was still a chance. Claire exhaled, her fingers tightening together, and asked where he had heard such things. He admitted it came from an old acquaintance from Facebook, noting that she didn't post much, but still used her old name. She told him she kept that name because it was tied to her degree and veterinary license, not because she was waiting for anyone to return. Marcus held her gaze, asking for just one dinner, saying he wasn't forcing anything, only wanting to talk without strings. Claire said nothing for a moment. The part of her that had once loved him sat buried somewhere deep, but above it lay the heavy memory of the years she had spent alone inside the very marriage meant to protect her. He had walked away when she needed him most, without a word, without a second look. She told him she was busy, that she didn't have time for old ghosts. He asked her what if he wasn't part of the old, but part of something new. His voice dropping in that familiar way he once used to reach the softest part of her. Before she could answer, another voice rose behind her. Daniel. He stood there with a bag of food in his hand, wearing a dark knit sweater, his eyes sharpening the moment he saw the man in front of her. Claire turned, a brief, unavoidable flicker of awkwardness passing through her. She told Daniel she was fine. Marcus looked at him and then at her, asking who he was. Claire answered without hesitation that he was the man who was with her now. Daniel stepped forward, not aggressively, but firmly, introducing himself as Daniel Rivas. Marcus gave a thin laugh, saying the name sounded like a character from a Mafia film. Daniel's expression didn't change. He said he was there because of Claire, nothing more, nothing less. The air tightened like a stretched string. Claire could feel her heartbeat thudding against her ribs, as though every wall she had built for herself was being pushed at once by two very different worlds she never wanted to collide. Marcus nodded slowly, looked at her one last time, and said she still had his old number. If she ever changed her mind, then turned and walked out quickly, as if afraid he would lose his resolve if he lingered. Daniel set the food bag down on the counter, his eyes still on the door that had just closed. He asked if she was truly all right. Claire nodded, though her gaze lingered on the empty space where Marcus had stood. She admitted she hadn't expected him to return. Daniel didn't press. He simply stepped closer and placed a hand on her back, gentle, careful, not to disturb the fragile swirl of emotion surrounding her. And in that moment, Claire understood that the past didn't have to be confronted all at once, that sometimes its shadows would return uninvited. But what mattered was the present, the person who stayed, the one who didn't walk away when storms came or when old memories rose, and that was what she chose to hold on to. Marcus did not disappear after that first unexpected encounter the way Claire had hoped he would. 3 days later, while she was walking with Daniel and Leo along the river near Forsyth Park, a black car slowly pulled to the curb. The window lowered, and a familiar voice rose, as if nothing had ever happened between them, asking whether they could talk for a moment. Daniel instinctively stepped half a pace forward, placing himself between her and the car, his body acting before his mind, and Leo let out a low growl, not vicious, but unmistakably a warning. Claire tightened the leash, her hand trembling slightly, though her voice stayed steady as she reminded Marcus she had already said everything she needed to say. Marcus stepped out of the car wearing a leather jacket, his face thinner than the last time she saw him, his eyes still carrying that mix of confidence and defiance she remembered too well, and told her he only wanted to ask a question. Daniel stood silent beside her, watching Marcus with the cool, alert stillness of someone accustomed to danger, not anger, but clarity. Marcus looked Daniel over and made a dry remark about him staying close, and Daniel answered that he was not hovering, but simply there because of Claire. Marcus shrugged and suggested she should choose a bluntness so shameless, Claire involuntarily stepped back, stunned. She asked what he really wanted, and Marcus admitted he was in trouble with finances and needed help, prompting Claire to let out a brittle, incredulous laugh when she realized he had come to her after disappearing for 2 years without a word, only to return now because he needed money. Daniel's voice dropped lower as he told Marcus it would be best if he left. Marcus looked him up and down, noting that he sounded familiar, saying he had met men like him before in Miami, and Daniel remained unmoved as he told him that if he were smart, he would know where the boundaries were. Claire placed her hand on Daniel's arm to hold him back, whispering that it wasn't worth it. Marcus saw the gesture, and something darkened in his eyes as he muttered that she now had a new protector, then turned toward his car but threw one last comment over his shoulder, warning Daniel that he hoped she would not discover who he truly was. The door slammed. The car sped off, and the air was left thick with the smell of exhaust and the simmering anger in Claire's chest. They continued their walk in silence, Daniel's hand holding hers, not tight, but anchored steady, allowing her to feel the calm pulse in his palm. That night, when Claire returned home, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, containing only a few chilling words, telling her Marcus should learn to behave. She sat still, staring at the screen, her finger hovering, but not replying, a cold ripple traveling down her spine. Not fear exactly, but the sharp awareness of standing between two worlds whose lines were far less clear than she had realized. The next morning, Emily burst into the break room, with wide eyes, asking whether Claire had heard the news. Marcus had been taken into temporary custody earlier that day in connection with a federal investigation into suspicious transactions, according to a lawyer client who had access to internal information, explaining he had been under surveillance for some time, and that officials finally had a reason to detain him. Claire felt herself go still, unsure whether to feel relieved or frightened. She stepped outside and called Daniel, asking whether he knew what had happened. After a pause, he said he had heard. She asked whether he had been involved, and he answered that it was not him, though his voice held neither denial nor ownership, as he added that he knew someone who cared enough about her to make sure Marcus would not trouble her again. Claire said nothing, torn between anger and gratitude, then asked him to promise her one thing, telling him that whatever he was, whatever he did, he should never turn her into someone she no longer recognized. Daniel exhaled slowly and promised. And with that promise, the fragile space between them became more delicate than ever, not because of secrets, but because of trust. A trust that would either become the foundation for something steady or the first crack of an eventual collapse. But for now, Claire knew only this: Marcus was gone, and Daniel was still here. Claire remained silent for the rest of the afternoon, but inside her, the storm would not settle. Every word Daniel had spoken over the phone echoed through her mind like a voice circling an empty room, each syllable carrying a weight she had tried so long to ignore. That line, "I know someone who cares enough about you not to let a man like him bother you again," was not simply a statement. It was a door cracking open onto a darkness she had never dared to face. When the clinic closed, she didn't go home. She drove aimlessly through the city, passing quiet streets and shuttering storefronts, until she found herself in front of the house Daniel often stayed in when he wasn't traveling. The porch light was still on. That warm glow usually made her feel safe. Tonight, it didn't. She stood at the door for a few minutes, inhaled deeply, then knocked 3 firm times. Daniel opened almost immediately, wearing a dark sweater and holding a cup of steaming coffee, surprise flickering across his face before shifting into concern as he read her expression. He invited her inside, but she shook her head and told him she hadn't come for coffee. Daniel paused, nodded, and stepped aside for her to enter. She stood in the living room, the air carrying that familiar scent of pine and soft mint, but this time it did not soothe her. She asked him what he had done to Marcus. The question sliced through the quiet like a blade. Daniel set his cup down slowly and told her he had done nothing. She told him not to insult her intelligence because when he said he knew who had acted, the meaning was clear. Daniel met her eyes, calm as always, but beneath that calm, she now recognized something guarded. He insisted he hadn't given orders or sent anyone, but admitted that Marcus should have been investigated long ago, and that certain people who owed him or wished to protect him, had decided not to stay quiet after Marcus threatened her. Claire folded her arms tightly across her chest, armoring herself, as she demanded to know who he truly was, saying no one manages family businesses and makes a man disappear from her life in 2 days without leaving a trace. Daniel did not answer right away. He walked to the window looking out, as though searching for the right words to reveal what he had spent years avoiding. He told her he had grown up in a family with its own laws, that when his father died, those around him expected him to take over. Not a company, but a responsibility, a power, a fear, and relationships never recorded on paper. Claire went still, each word falling like another layer of armor peeling back, exposing a reality she had never imagined. She asked what she was supposed to be in that world, someone he protected, or a weakness. Daniel turned back to her, no longer hiding anything in his eyes, and told her she was the only person he wanted to keep, not to control, but to be understood by, even if only partly. Claire's breath shortened, her hands turning cold. She told him she wasn't sure she could live with that she was a veterinarian, someone who healed, not someone who survived in a world where people vanished for speaking one wrong sentence. Daniel stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could see the way his eyes softened, and told her he had never wanted to pull her into that world, and that if she wanted to leave, he would not hold her back. But he would not apologize for Marcus. He said he was a man who protected those he loved by whatever means necessary. Claire swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to believe that this kind of protection was something good, but another part feared that accepting it would mean losing the person she believed herself to be. She whispered that she needed time, then stepped back and left before Daniel could stop her. He didn't call after her. He only stood there watching. And Claire realized that even though her heart still beat for him, still longed for his arms, a wall had begun rising between them, not built from secrets anymore, but from truth. And truth was the thing that made everything impossible to see the same way again. 3 days later, on a moonless night, Claire received a message from Daniel, short, without pleading, only a single line telling her that if she still wanted to know who he truly was, she should come, followed by an address in the far southern edge of the city near the docks. A place she had never been. A place people whispered about with names that never appeared on any travel map. Claire sat behind the wheel for more than 5 minutes, turning around no fewer than 3 times in her mind. But finally, she shut off the engine and stepped out. The house was not large, its exterior covered in ivy and weathered red brick, but inside it was unexpectedly warm. Daniel sat in an armchair in the living room, wearing a black shirt, a glass of wine in his hand, the soft amber light illuminating half his face in a way that made him look both familiar and distant. He did not rise when she entered, only motioned to the chair across from him, and thanked her for coming, his voice low but not tense. Claire sat, her eyes fixed on him, telling him she had come to listen, and was not sure she would stay afterward, and Daniel nodded, saying he understood. He set the glass down, his hands clasping together as if gathering whatever courage remained. He told her he had been born in the south of Savannah, the son of a Cuban father and an Italian-American mother, and that while the family appeared unremarkable on the surface, power in certain places did not live on paper, but in handshakes after dinner and phone calls that were never recorded, and that his father had been one of those men. Claire stayed quiet, lips pressed tightly, but never interrupting. Daniel continued, his voice slow, peeling away layers like old paint from a door, telling her that when he was 16, he first saw his father command men without raising his voice, simply sipping his coffee and speaking one sentence, and older men bowed their heads and obeyed, and that was when he realized the world did not move through laws, but through fear and loyalty. He paused, looking down at his hands, and said he had not chosen the path, but once someone stepped into it, leaving was almost impossible. And when his father died, he was the only one clear-headed, cold enough and angry enough to hold everything together. She could call it Mafia if she wanted, he said, and he would not argue, but to him it was family people who would die in his place without asking why. Claire felt her heart pounding not from fear but from the stark honesty in his words. Daniel was not hiding or romanticizing anything, he was stripping himself bare, exposing a past he had likely never spoken aloud. He told her there was a time he thought he would spend his entire life in that world, sending Olivia to school with bodyguards using false names, whenever he left the state signing contracts on paper but never writing the real words. Then he said he met her. Claire exhaled softly as though her heart had finally unclenched after days of tension. She asked why he was telling her all of this now, and he gave her a sad smile, the saddest she had ever seen on him, saying it was because she had asked, and because he didn't want her to love a man she didn't truly know. She asked whether he thought she loved him, the words escaping like breath, yet marking the first time she admitted the possibility. Daniel did not answer. Instead, he rose and walked toward her slowly, each step careful, as if afraid of shattering something fragile between them. He told her he wanted her to choose not between him and anyone else, but between darkness and light, and that if she walked away after tonight, he would not blame her, but if she stayed, he promised she would never need to fear the man standing beside her. Claire looked at him for a long time, without tears or words, but with a quiet storm in her eyes. Then she stood, moving closer, not to flee, but to look more closely, as if making sure he was truly the same man who had opened his car door in the rain that night, who had brought apple pastries to the clinic, who looked at her as though she were the answer to years of wandering. When she placed her hand on his chest where his heartbeat remained steady beneath her palm, she whispered that she was not promising anything, but she was still here. Daniel didn't smile, but she felt the release in his shoulders, the subtle shift of someone who for the first time in many years could finally breathe. That night, Claire did not go home immediately after her conversation with Daniel. She drove aimlessly through the narrow streets of Savannah, where the pale gold of the streetlights shimmered against the wet pavement, where the shuttered doors of quiet houses suggested a peace she was no longer certain she still belonged to. In her mind, Daniel's voice continued to echo, steady and honest, without a single apology for who he was, and strangely, that unsettled her more than anything else. She had always believed that if the truth ever surfaced, she would know exactly what to do, that she would walk away, save herself the way she once did after leaving Marcus. But this time was different. Because Daniel was not Marcus. He had not hidden things to manipulate her. He had hidden them because he feared she would leave. And when Claire finally returned to her small apartment close to midnight, she only managed a quick shower before collapsing onto the sofa, arms wrapped around a thin pillow, eyes wide open against the ceiling. Inside her was a battle with no victor, her mind insisting that loving a man like Daniel meant wagering her life on a gray world she could not control, and her heart replaying his laughter, his tenderness with his daughter, the way he looked at her as if she were the answer to something broken in him. At the same time, in Daniel's quiet house, the light in the living room was still on. He sat alone, holding a glass of wine that had gone cold without taking a sip, staring out the window into the endless stretch of darkness, wondering whether he should abandon everything he knew for the sake of one woman. Then footsteps sounded softly on the stairs. Olivia, in kitten-patterned pajamas with sleep-tousled hair and drowsy eyes, came down and silently curled up beside him, drawing her legs onto the chair, the way she had done since she was little. Daniel turned to her and rested a hand on her shoulder, asking why she wasn't asleep. Olivia looked at him, curious rather than frightened, and asked whether he and Claire had fought. He told her not exactly, that he had simply revealed a part of his life he had always tried to hide. She asked whether it was the part he never told her about, and Daniel hesitated. Olivia was only 12, but perceptive and far wiser than her age. She had asked about her mother, why her father avoided crowded places, and why men in black suits always followed him at school meetings. Daniel had never told her the truth, but he had never truly lied either. He finally told her yes, explaining that some things remained unspoken, not because she was too young, but because he didn't want her burdened with unnecessary fear. Olivia tilted her head as if weighing this, then asked whether Claire was afraid now that she knew. Daniel admitted she might be, that she needed time. Olivia was quiet for a moment, then turned to him and asked whether he loved Claire. Daniel looked into eyes that were nearly identical to his, and told her yes, more than anyone before. Olivia nodded thoughtfully, and said that he should show Claire who he really was, not the man with shadows around him, but the man who taught her to make scrambled eggs without burning them, the man who cried when she had a high fever, the man who read every page of Harry Potter, even though he mispronounced all the names. Daniel let out a soft laugh, almost a breath. She insisted she had seen him cry the night he feared she might not make it till morning. She said Claire should know that part too, not only the part he hid. Daniel pulled her into his arms and kissed the top of her head, thanking her. She told him not to scare Claire. Daniel promised he would try. When Olivia fell asleep against him, he carried her up the stairs, his heart lighter, though still tangled with conflict. And as he tucked her into bed, he understood that there were things he could never change, his past, the tangled web around him, but there were things he could choose to rebuild. And Claire. Perhaps she was his last chance to live honestly with that choice. Claire woke the next morning feeling as heavy as if she had not slept at all. She had dreamed of Daniel, but not the soft, tender dreams they once shared after their first date, or the quiet moments when he stopped by the clinic. These dreams were half real, half shadow, filled with dim corridors and closed doors, where she wandered searching for him in silence. And each time she reached for a doorknob, fear rose at what truth might stand behind it. She brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring out the window as the first light threaded through the trees outside her porch, the city still calm while inside her a storm churned. She had spent the whole night thinking not only about Daniel's confession, not only about who he truly was, but about how he told her with honesty, stripped of excuses, with eyes that never pleaded. He hadn't tried to change himself, nor had he promised to abandon his world. He had simply given her the right to know and the right to choose, and that was the very thing she could not walk away from. She called Emily, hoping a voice outside her own heart might steady her. Emily listened silent for several seconds, before sighing and telling her she still loved him. Claire pressed her forehead to the table. She knew. And Emily told her she would never step into anything unless she believed there was light somewhere ahead. Claire asked what would happen if that light was an illusion, and Emily said at least she would have tried instead of spending a lifetime haunted by the question of what might have been. Claire whispered that she feared losing herself, and Emily replied that if someone made her feel she had to pretend, that was the sign to leave, but if someone gave her space to remain fully herself, even if he came from a different world, then she was choosing something brave. After the call, Claire stayed at the table for several minutes, turning her now cold coffee in her hands. She did not know what the future would bring, but she knew one thing with clarity. Daniel had never frightened her, not truly. He made her wonder, made her question, but never made her tremble from fear. If anything, he was the man who had made her feel safe the very first moment she met him, even while her rational mind screamed caution. That afternoon she stopped by the clinic, only to check a few papers. When she walked in, Emily looked at her, smiled knowingly, and returned to her client as if she already understood the choice that had been made. Claire straightened a few documents, sent a message to reschedule an appointment, and left. She did not go home. Instead, she went to Daniel's house without warning and without an excuse. Daniel opened the door just as she rang the bell for the second time. He looked tired, whether from lack of sleep or from losing hope that she might return. But when he saw her, something in him stilled and softened, as if her presence was the answer to a question he had been holding too tightly. Claire didn't speak at first. She simply looked at him for a long moment, as though committing his face to memory once more. Then she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She told him she wasn't certain she could live in his world, that she wasn't used to rules that never appeared in writing, that she feared what she couldn't control, and she knew a part of her would always worry that one day something could happen without warning. Daniel nodded, saying he understood. She added that she also knew she had never felt so seen or so understood, that he had never tried to change her or push her toward the life he lived, that he had simply stayed by her side. Daniel stepped toward her, watching her like a man afraid one breath might make her vanish. Claire told him she had realized that if she had to choose between walking away to protect her sense of certainty or staying for the sake of something she had never known before, she would choose the latter. Daniel did not pull her into his arms. Instead, he reached out and took her hand gently, as though pressing too hard might shatter something delicate between them. Claire closed her fingers around his, not tightly, just enough for him to understand that this time she would not pull away. And with that simple touch in the quiet of the room, something began to take root, not certainty, but the promise that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. In the days after Claire chose to stay with Daniel, something between them softened, steadied, as though they had finally found a shared rhythm within lives that had always moved out of sync. They saw each other more often, sometimes spending quiet evenings eating takeout noodles on Daniel's balcony, sometimes passing lazy afternoons at the clinic where Claire played with Leo while chatting with Olivia about biology homework. But just as Claire began to believe she could navigate the place where their worlds touched, something happened that shook her in a way she never expected. On a Monday morning when Claire arrived at the clinic, Emily stood at the door with eyes wide as if witnessing a miracle pulling Claire inside. The waiting room was nearly twice its original size. The floor freshly retiled, a brand new ultrasound machine gleaming in the left corner, the medicine cabinet replaced with a humidity-controlled model, and the exam table, the old steel one she had used since her first day, now replaced with a modern polished version. Claire stood stunned, unable to breathe for a moment, asking who had done all of this, and Emily showed her a note posted on the board that read, "Anonymous donor," explaining breathlessly that someone had spent a fortune upgrading the clinic with equipment a small place like theirs could never dream of affording. Claire looked around, feeling her heart sink with each detail, because everything about it, the silence, the precision, the perfection, felt unmistakably like Daniel. She said nothing. She simply turned and walked out, calling him the moment she reached her car. When he answered after 3 rings, she asked whether he had done it. Her voice soft but sharp, and his half-beat of silence was all the confirmation she needed before he admitted he only wanted to help, that the clinic needed upgrades and he could see that. Claire reminded him she had not asked, and he replied she didn't need to. Her grip tightened on the wheel, heat rising through her chest, as she told him that was the problem, that she did not want someone making choices for her in the places that mattered. He insisted he only wanted to make her life easier, and she asked whether making her feel the clinic was no longer hers was part of that, whether walking into her workplace and not recognizing it was supposed to ease anything for her. Daniel exhaled sharply, and for the first time in weeks she heard a crack of frustration in his voice, as he said he thought she would be happy, that it was his way of showing he cared. Claire blinked back tears of anger and hurt, telling him caring was not the same as control, and that not everything could be fixed with money that she loved. The clinic, not because it was beautiful, but because it was the work of her hands, of Emily's hands, shaped by every patient that had walked through their doors. Daniel grew quiet before apologizing, not with the gentle apologies he sometimes used, but with the weight of someone realizing he had misstepped. He admitted he was used to solving problems his way, and Claire told him that was exactly what frightened her, that she did not want to become someone orbiting his decisions, losing her own life and boundaries. Daniel's voice lowered as he offered to undo everything. Bring the clinic back to the way it was, if that was what she wanted. Claire closed her eyes, her chest aching, telling him she didn't want to go back only to be asked first. On the other end of the line, Daniel's voice grew deeper, edged with a fear she had never heard before, asking what she needed from him now. Claire drew in a steadying breath and told him she needed to know they were 2 people walking side by side, not him leading while she ran to keep up. And for the first time, Daniel did not have an immediate answer. It was that moment of silence that made Claire realize that if they were going to move forward, they would have to learn how to speak to each other in true equality, not through one-sided sacrifice, not through overprotection, but through choice from both of them. 3 days after that heavy phone call, Claire did not send Daniel a single message. She still went to the clinic, still smiled at clients, still worked with Emily to soothe frightened cats and trembling old dogs. But inside her was a nameless emptiness, a mix of anger, longing, and quiet doubt about the choice she had made. On Saturday evening, while she was organizing the medicine cabinet at the end of her shift, the clinic door suddenly opened. Daniel walked in without warning, without flowers of apology, without the soft expression he usually carried. He stood there beneath the warm yellow light, his dark gray shirt catching the glow, and in his eyes was a resolve colder than any she had seen in him before. Claire stood upright, wiped her hands, folded her arms, and met his silence with her own. Daniel spoke first, his voice low and direct, telling her he was a man used to commanding an entire system, giving orders that were obeyed without question, that it was how he survived, how he kept himself, Olivia, and everyone he cared for safe, and that he had never learned how to ask permission. Claire lifted her chin and asked whether he thought he didn't need to learn with her, and Daniel clenched his fist, saying that wasn't what he meant, but that she couldn't expect him to turn into another kind of man simply because she disliked how he solved problems. Claire told him she was not asking him to change who he was, only to treat her as an equal, not as a woman who needed protecting or someone whose life he could untangle with money, but as a partner, someone whose voice mattered. Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head, as he reminded her she worked with animals, while he worked with people capable of killing each other over a contract, that his world had no room for mistakes, that if he didn't act first, others would act for him, and she couldn't understand that. Claire stepped closer, her voice taut as a stretched wire, as she said he was right, that she did not understand that world and did not want to understand it. But if he continued to use it as an excuse for not respecting her, he should not be surprised if she refused to stay. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, the kind of silence that sat on the thin line between past and future, before saying quietly that he had never meant to control her, that he acted because he knew no other way to show he cared. Claire answered that caring was not doing everything on her behalf, but listening, asking first, allowing her to be tired, to be weak to decide. Daniel sat down, his hands clasped between his knees, his head bent as though a burden he had carried for years finally had a name, admitting he was used to protecting the people he loved with power. But she did not need that. Claire sat next to him and touched his hand for the first time in days, telling him she didn't need power, she needed trust. Daniel lifted his gaze, his eyes faintly shining. She could not tell whether from exhaustion or emotion, confessing he had never loved anyone without trying to hold on by any means he had, but perhaps keeping her was not about holding tight, but learning to ease his grip. Claire smiled softly, her voice gentler as she told him he didn't need to ease too far, only to learn to walk beside her instead of ahead. Daniel nodded slowly, and in the warm glow of the clinic lights, neither of them spoke again. But when Claire laid her hand in his, not too firmly, yet firmly enough, something shifted between them, not an end to conflict, but the beginning of a deeper understanding, the kind that no longer needed proof in words, but in patience, in choosing to sit together after the storm of an argument, and in choosing still to love, in a more grown, steady way. 1 week after their fierce argument, just as things between Claire and Daniel seemed to have settled into a new balance, Daniel sent her a message on Saturday morning that read, "Come to my place for dinner tonight. Olivia will be here, and there's a small surprise." Claire stared at the words, feeling her heart beat slow for a moment. Olivia, that 12-year-old girl who was the brightest piece of Daniel's life, was no small detail, and Claire understood without him saying it that this was a step that mattered. Meeting family was never simple, especially when the man inviting you lived within the gray edges of a world most people only whispered about, yet guarded his daughter as the one untouched source of light. Claire arrived at 6 o'clock with a box of homemade cookies, the second batch, because she had burned the first, telling herself that children liked anything with chocolate chips. Daniel's home glowed with warm yellow light, the scent of something roasting drifting from the kitchen. He opened the door wearing a pale blue shirt and jeans, a softer version of himself, as though he too was trying to blend into something more ordinary for the night. As soon as Claire stepped inside, Olivia poked her head out from the kitchen, her hair tied in a ponytail, a ladle still in her hand, calling out that the sauce was getting too thick before turning to Claire, with surprise lighting up her eyes as she asked if she was the veterinarian who had stitched up Mrs. Walker's cat. Claire laughed and admitted she had indeed brought cookies to bribe the chef, and Olivia narrowed her eyes thoughtfully in an almost grandmotherly way, asking what flavor they were before announcing the slightly burnt but fragrant aroma was good enough to earn Claire a point. Daniel watched from the side, his smile small but softened, with something almost tender, as if witnessing a moment he never dared to hope for. During dinner, Olivia talked more than both adults combined, telling stories from school about the neighbor's overweight dog, Muffin, who stole the cat's food, and about her science teacher mispronouncing esophagus 3 times until the whole class erupted in laughter. Claire listened, offering small jokes that made Olivia giggle, and made Daniel glance at her every so often, as if he were discovering some new part of her. Near the end of the meal, a woman slightly older walked in from the back door, carrying a basket of bread. Daniel introduced her as Camila, the aunt who raised him, and Claire could see the deep respect in his eyes when he spoke her name. Camila had silver hair pulled into a tight bun, a stern face softened by mischievous eyes, and she looked Claire up and down with a silence that made Claire tense before nodding and saying she didn't look like someone who would be easily swallowed whole. Olivia burst out laughing, explaining that Aunt Camilla called most of Daniel's former girlfriends soft candy pretty but quick to melt. Claire flushed, unsure what to say, until Camilla added in a gentler voice that Claire had the look of someone unafraid to get blood on her hands for a puppy, but soft enough to cry for 3 days when the first stray she tried to save didn't make it, and Claire admitted that was exactly what she had done. Camilla's smile then warmed the first truly tender expression she had shown, and she said that meant Claire just might be able to save Daniel too. The evening ended with laughter, slightly burnt cookies that somehow tasted perfect, and a cup of hot cocoa Olivia made especially for Claire. As Claire gathered her things to leave, Olivia ran after her and slipped a small piece of paper into her hand, whispering that Claire was the first person her father had invited home since her mother, and asking her not to hurt him, because he would never say it aloud, but she knew. Claire pulled the girl into her arms, her heart softening like water settling after a storm. Driving home that night, Claire realized she wasn't just falling in love with a complicated man. She was stepping quietly into a family, a small, unusual, spirited family, but warmer than anything she had known in a very long time. On Sunday morning, as Savannah settled under a soft, familiar rain, Claire woke in Daniel's kitchen with the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting through the room like a quiet overture to a day without hurry. She was still wearing his oversized shirt, her hair twisted loosely at the back of her neck, her hands wrapped around a warm mug as she stepped into the kitchen where Daniel stood with his back to her barefoot chopping onions for an omelet in a simple black t-shirt. Looking so calm, it felt as though the world outside with all its complications had never laid a hand on him. Leaning against the counter, Claire sipped her coffee and teased that if someone took a picture of this scene, they would think he was a perfect man. And without turning around, he tilted his head and asked who said he wasn't. She laughed softly and moved closer, just as he set the omelet on the table, and they ate in a gentle, unhurried silence, broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and the faint clink of forks on porcelain. Near the end of breakfast, Daniel stood to get more orange juice and, without seeming to think, opened the drawer beneath the microwave. Claire turned at the small metallic sound and saw him holding a small black box. There was no dramatic music, no roses, no candles, no kneeling. Just Daniel standing in a kitchen marked with a few tomato stains on the counter. His eyes steady with quiet resolve, speaking clearly above the rhythm of rain outside. He told her he wasn't sure he could offer her a normal life, but if she would agree to be his wife, he promised to love her in his own way with everything he had and learn little by little whatever she needed from him. Claire froze for several seconds, stunned. She had not expected this, not after an ordinary evening, not when she had only just begun thinking about moving in. She set her cup down and slowly stood, her gaze falling on the ring in the box. Simple, understated, a small stone, glinting on a silver band, unpretentious, uncomplicated, exactly like Daniel, and exactly like the way he loved her, without flourish but true to the bone. She stepped toward him, not taking the ring, not answering, yet merely touching his cheek, her fingers brushing the strong line of his jaw, and she asked softly if he was certain. Daniel smiled, a small smile that still made her heart tilt, and said he was as certain as he had been this morning when he realized he couldn't drink coffee unless she made it. Claire laughed, and in that moment everything seemed to quiet: the rain, the soft hiss of the stove, even her own confusion. She nodded and said yes, though she would keep her clinic keys and would not change her name. Daniel laughed, wrapped his arms around her with the tenderness of someone holding something precious for the first time, and told her those terms were perfectly acceptable and that her yes was all that mattered. Olivia would later recount how she came downstairs to see her father spinning Claire in the middle of the kitchen, the omelet sliding off the plate and the ring nearly slipping to the floor when Leo sneezed at exactly the wrong moment. But what Claire remembered most about that rainy morning was not the proposal nor the ring, but the sense of relief, as if she had finally set down a heavy suitcase after a long journey. She had chosen a man who was imperfect, who lived in a world marked by shadows. But she also knew that in those shadows his hand had always reached for her, not to force or to hold too tightly, but to take hers gently, firmly enough that she never felt lost. And for the first time in her life, she felt she truly belonged, not to a house, but to a person. Claire moved into Daniel's home on a soft, sun-warmed Saturday morning, a few weeks after the engagement ring had settled onto her hand, as though it had always belonged there. The move wasn't difficult. Her old East Side apartment had been small, holding little more than a lazy sofa, a low bookshelf, and a three-legged cat named Pudding. Daniel offered to hire movers, but Claire laughed and said she wasn't bringing her whole world with her, only the pieces that made her feel like herself. So that morning, Daniel's SUV was filled with boxes of books, soft blankets, a few clumsy cat paintings she had made, and a small elephant-shaped lamp Olivia declared adorably tacky. Daniel's house had always been spacious, orderly, and slightly cold, with its dark gray tones, wide glass windows, and minimalist furniture. But within days of Claire living there, the space began to shift. A blue and white checkered tablecloth appeared on the dining table. The kitchen gained a jar of dried lavender Claire claimed was to cancel out the smell of fried onions. Pudding claimed the living room windowsill as though it had been built for him alone. Olivia, cautious at first, slowly warmed to the idea of having someone who made nighttime cocoa, checked her English essays, and sometimes hummed softly in the kitchen while cooking. Claire never tried to be a stepmother. She was simply present, listening, advising, knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. Camila, who still came for dinner every weekend, observed after 2 weeks that the house was finally filled with real laughter, not just the sound of spoons touching plates. And Daniel, though he didn't say much, began to change in the smallest, most telling ways. He learned to ask before helping. He learned to let Claire cook, even though she chopped onions as if cutting straw. He learned to wait for her to close the clinic so they could walk together around the park, while she told him about a 3-year-old dog who had eaten chocolate but still tried to lick the veterinarian's hand. Claire had to learn, too, how to sleep through Daniel's heavy footsteps when he went downstairs at 2 in the morning for work, how not to ask questions when he stepped outside to take a call. He couldn't explain, but also how to ask for reassurance when unease crept into her chest. They learned each other through small collisions, through silence and misunderstandings, always finding their way back with a sincere apology and an embrace held long enough to forget why they were upset in the first place. One night, while Claire was arranging books on a new shelf, Daniel wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder, in a habit that felt newly grown. He asked whether she felt strange living there, and Claire paused before smiling, saying she did, though it was the kind of strangeness that felt pleasant, like wearing shoes slightly too big at first, only to discover they were deeply comfortable. Daniel held her gently and said he was still learning to live with a three-legged cat and the smell of dried flowers in the kitchen, and she replied she was learning to love a man who didn't talk much, but whose eyes spoke for him whenever he was tired. In that house, they didn't live a perfect life, but they lived honestly. Each day was a small adjustment, a small compromise, a small surprise, and countless ordinary moments no one would ever put into a movie. But it was those ordinary moments that made Claire stay. Not because Daniel was a flawless man, but because he was a man willing to correct himself, and not because the house was large or beautiful, but because inside it, she had finally found a place where belonging felt real. Claire was drying the dishes after dinner when she heard Daniel speaking on the phone in his study, his voice lower than usual, not exactly angry, not exactly worried, but edged with a tension she recognized instantly. She couldn't make out the words or the person on the other end, only a name she had never heard before: Lorenzo. When Daniel stepped out, his expression had returned to its usual calm, but Claire was perceptive enough to notice the stiffness in his shoulders, the slight avoidance in his eyes when she asked if everything was all right, and he simply replied, "Yeah, just old business," before shifting the conversation to Olivia's school project. Claire didn't press, but unease settled in her chest, like a spark hidden beneath ash. The next morning, Daniel said he had to leave early and skipped breakfast with her and Olivia. Claire kissed his cheek at the door, though inside she found herself silently counting the minutes after he stepped away from the house. She kept herself composed through the morning at the clinic, laughing with clients, changing bandages, pretending nothing in her world was shifting. But at noon, while she was dressing the burn on an old dog's leg, her phone buzzed with a message containing only 2 words. Met him. No name, no signature, but she knew immediately who it was, and even more clearly that something was wrong. That afternoon, Daniel came home later than usual, his shirt rumpled, the cuff smeared with dried blood that wasn't his. Claire watched him from the kitchen, every muscle in her body tightened like a pulled wire. He didn't meet her eyes as he removed his jacket, only murmured that he had something to tell her. They sat at the dining table in a silence that made even the familiar kitchen feel foreign. Daniel told her about meeting Lorenzo Moretti, a former partner from nearly 10 years earlier, back when he was still entangled in the Southern weapons network he had since walked away from. Lorenzo had just been released from prison, carrying an old debt and a reminder of the brotherhood they once shared. He wanted to work together again, offering one last deal, a profit, big enough, he claimed, to let them all walk away forever. Claire clenched her hands, her voice steady but heavy, as she asked what Daniel thought. For the first time, she saw real exhaustion in his eyes, as he answered that he told Lorenzo no, that he had her, he had Olivia, and he needed nothing else. But Lorenzo was not the kind of man who accepted refusal. Claire stood, stepping back from the table, as though a few feet of space could help her breathe. Her voice trembling as she asked whether he was certain none of this would bleed into their lives, whether she should expect to wake at night to blood on his hands, or someone knocking at their door, demanding repayment for a past she never lived. Daniel moved behind her without touching her, telling her softly that he could not promise to erase his past, but he could promise it would not define their future. Claire turned, her eyes filled with wary disbelief, and asked what he would do if he had to choose between protecting her and keeping that promise. Daniel was silent for a long time before answering, in a low voice meant only for her. He would do anything to protect her, even if it meant she might one day hate him. The answer cut her with equal fear and sorrow, because she knew Daniel's love always came with shadows. But for the first time she wondered whether her heart could endure a future where that love forced her to live in a world where light was always dimmed by dangers she could not yet name. That night, while Daniel slept, Claire sat alone in the kitchen staring at the ring on her finger, still shining as brightly as the morning he proposed, yet suddenly heavy with questions she did not know how to hold. She loved him, she had never doubted that. But loving a man like Daniel was not just choosing joy, it was choosing to survive with him through storms his past had seeded. And now the storm was close, close enough that she could feel its wind at the door. That day in Savannah was unusually cold for early spring, and Claire sat on the front steps with a loose sweater around her shoulders, her hands curled around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Before her magnolia petals drifted to the ground, a soft reminder that even the most beautiful things could wither if no one tended to them. Daniel stepped out from the house quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile air settling between them. He said nothing at first, only sat beside her, with his shoulder leaning just enough toward hers to offer warmth without crowding her space. After a long while, it was he who broke the silence. He didn't ask if she was all right, and he didn't offer the kind of apology men reach for when they know they have caused pain. He simply said in a voice plain and honest, "I know you're afraid." Claire did not react at once, though her lips tightened and her eyes stayed fixed on the quiet yard ahead. "I'm not afraid of you," she said softly. "I'm afraid of the world you came from. Afraid of the dark doors I cannot see behind. Afraid of waking up one day realizing I don't know what I'm living for anymore, except to wait for the next bad thing to happen." Daniel exhaled slowly and nodded. "I know. I lived with that feeling for so long I forgot how terrifying it is. But I'm not going back there. Not for money, not for power, not for nostalgia. The only reason I stepped toward it again was because I thought I needed to close it once and for all to protect what I have now." Claire turned then for the first time that afternoon, doubt flickering like a faint flame in her eyes. "And you really believe you can do that? You think someone like Lorenzo will simply walk away because you said no?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I know he won't. But just as I once found a way out of that world, men like Lorenzo, or any shadow that still tries to reach for me, won't pull me back unless I allow it. Every day I live with you and Olivia, I am more certain I don't belong there anymore." Claire fell silent for a moment, and then she said what had been pressing against her heart. "I don't need you to be a hero. I don't need you to be some kind of moral example either. I just need you to be honest with me. Don't hide anything from me again, no matter how ugly it is." Daniel met her eyes without flinching. "I promise. I can't change my past, but I can give you every truth of who I am now, and I can build a future with you that you don't have to fear." They stayed like that for a long time, surrounded by the soft rustle of wind and the damp smell of earth after last night's rain. Claire tilted her head and rested lightly on Daniel's shoulder. There were no declarations, no tears, only the gradual sinking of their breaths and the quiet return of trust. This time it was not the blind kind that had bloomed the day they first met in the rain, but a deliberate choice, the choice to stay, even knowing there would be storms, the choice to love a man who was not flawless, but who was willing to make amends, the choice to believe that the past might shape a person but did not have to imprison them. As the sky dimmed, Daniel wrapped an arm around her and held her a little closer. "Whatever happens, I won't let go first. But if the day comes when you feel you can't stay, I only ask that you tell me before you turn away." Claire nodded gently. "I won't turn away, not now. Not when you were the first person who ever looked at me and said, 'I'll take you home,' and meant it." In the quiet yard between two people marked by histories not easily named love, no longer felt like something vague or fragile. It had become a choice made again and again, every day, every minute, in spite of fear, and today they chose each other once more. The storm Daniel had feared did try to break, but it was silenced before it ever reached their door. 2 weeks later, a brief news segment mentioned Lorenzo's arrest for a parole violation triggered by anonymous evidence that had surfaced quietly but undeniably. Daniel never spoke of the details, and Claire never asked. She only watched the lingering tension finally leave his shoulders, seeing him stand not as a guardian bracing for a fight, but simply as a man who had finally locked the door on his past. That afternoon, sunlight stretched across the kitchen window, like a soft blanket, laid gently over everything it touched. The smell of fresh pastries drifted from the oven, mingling with the bright laughter of Olivia and Claire as they bickered playfully over who would spread the frosting onto the cake Camilla had prepared earlier that morning. Daniel stood in the doorway, his hand wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, watching them with an expression that belonged to a man who finally understood what it meant for a home to breathe. In that kitchen, no one was perfect, yet every moment felt alive. Claire turned, caught his gaze, and smiled a smile free of hesitation, free of the old boundaries between who he once was and who he was now. What remained was a family stitched together by simple things, a homemade dinner, a funny story retold from school, a hug given without reason, and a hand that never let go. Dinner was nothing extravagant, just spaghetti salad, garlic butter toast, and a cheap bottle of wine Camilla insisted they open, because in her words, the taste isn't good, but it gives you something to laugh about. They ate, they talked, and afterward they cleaned up together. Pudding leapt onto the table, earning a gentle scolding from Olivia, before Claire scooped the cat up and stroked it like an irreplaceable part of the household. As the sky turned the color of old amber, Daniel put on a light jazz record, and for a moment the whole world seemed to pause. No one mentioned the past. They didn't need to. They had walked through it, chosen each other, and most importantly chosen to keep going. Claire washed glasses while Daniel dried the plates. It was an ordinary action, almost unremarkable, yet inside it lived understanding, trust, and the beginning of a future built from small, steady gestures. Olivia read on the sofa, Camilla dozed off in the armchair, and pudding curled into a warm ball beneath the table. Claire looked up at Daniel. "Do you ever think that if my car hadn't broken down that day, we wouldn't have met?" Daniel smiled and set the towel aside. "I don't know. But I do know that if I hadn't met you that day, the rest of my life would have felt like something was missing, even if I never understood why." Claire stepped closer, resting her head against his chest. "I feel the same." In the fading glow of evening, people who had once been hurt, once afraid, once touched by darkness, found something unexpectedly simple: peace. Not the dramatic kind, not the loud kind, just the quiet harmony of two hearts beating in rhythm, choosing to slow down, choosing to love more deeply, choosing to be grateful for every fragile minute. Claire and Daniel's story might have begun with a broken-down car in the rain, but it did not end with a grand wedding or a sweeping declaration. It ended in the place where all true love stories eventually lead: a small kitchen, the warmth of late afternoon light, and the unmistakable feeling of belonging. Because sometimes what saves us is not something grand, but the quiet, steadfast presence of someone who chooses to stay. And that is the greatest lesson this story carries. Love is a choice. It is staying when leaving would be easier, forgiving when the past is imperfect, trusting when nothing is guaranteed, and building every single day with gratitude. If you are watching this far, thank you for journeying with us through this emotional story. If it touched you in any way, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, so these small but meaningful values can reach more hearts. Where are you watching from? Did this story remind you of something in your own life? Share your thoughts below so we can listen to the feelings you carry, because every word you leave behind becomes another thread that makes this story more meaningful. Thank you for being here, wishing you good health, a peaceful spirit, and a life lived fully, one day at a time. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.